Okay, so we've had three producers take the stage, so we're moving now into some explorer and developers. So up next we have Dudley Kingsnorth, Chairman of Australian Rare Earths. Dudley refers to himself as a lapsed metallurgist. He has over 50 years' experience in the international mining industry, 30 of which have been in rare earth sector here in Australia. As Chairman of Australian Rare Earths, Dudley's presentation will outline Australia's role in the development of global, environmentally sustainable rare earth supply. So please welcome Dudley.
Thank you, Paul. I just wish to begin by acknowledging the great efforts of Jim Walker and Suzanne Christie and the team at Diggers to give us another stimulating Diggers forum this year. It's just under 3 years ago that I was approached by the two founders of Australian Rare Earths, and they asked me to serve on the board, and I had a look at it. Copper is an ionic clay resource. At that time, the world was wholly dependent upon China and Myanmar for the production of those rare earths that go into production of rare earth permanent magnets. In particular, when you produce a rare earth permanent magnet that has to operate in elevated temperatures, you require dysprosium and terbium. The world is 100% dependent 100% for the supply of dysprosium and terbium upon China and Myanmar. Having recognised that, having had a look at the ore body, the potential for processing, there was some preliminary test work from ANSTO available, and the very strong emphasis by both Rick and Bryn on community relations, I accepted the offer to be the chairman with some excitement, and that's why I'm here today, and I'm still pretty excited about our opportunity. It's a non-disclosure agreement. To become a successful producer or participant in a critical material supply chain, one has to be able to participate through collaboration on the whole supply chain, right the way from the mine to the original equipment. Unfortunately, most of the original equipment manufacturers today think that their supply chain begins at a metal. It doesn't. It begins at a mine. And I think the Australian mining industry has really got to work harder to talk to the original equipment manufacturers and make them realise that their supply chain does begin at a mine, and that there's some strong obligations that are going to be put in place very soon in Europe and elsewhere, where we have supply chain, life of supply chains, where we've got to demonstrate that throughout the supply chain, right from the beginning, which includes the mine, complies with all international environmental standards. From an Australian Rare Earths point of view, we recognise that. In fact, only 7 weeks ago, we appointed our new CEO, Travis Benke, and invite you to come and meet him at our stand. Within a week of him being appointed, he was on a plane to Estonia, and he was there for the groundbreaking ceremony of a new rare earth permanent magnet facility that's going to be built by Neo Performance Materials, the world leader in production of bonded rare earth permanent magnets. That visit to Estonia enabled Travis to meet with the CEO of Neo Performance Materials and the key people there, and we have a supply agreement in place with them, and I'll come back to that later. And also to tour the facilities that Neo Performance Material has in Estonia to see the separation and other facilities which will be processing the rare earth carbonate that we intend to produce. "30 years ago, about this time, I embarked on my first marketing trip to Europe. And the first visit I had was to Johnston & Matthey. And I was invited to go there by the procurement manager, and he said, "Now, Dudley, when you arrive, we want you to make a presentation on the project, but you've got to make quite sure that we understand what you intend to do in terms of minimising the impact on the environment." So I went to the UK, and I actually went to the plant Royston where they make the autocatalysts, and I was met by the managing director. And he took me into a board. It's a little bit intimidating on your first marketing trip, but nevertheless, I made a presentation on the project and talked in some detail about how we were going to manage the impact on the environment at the mine, and at that stage, the proposal was to carry out the processing at Northam. talked about how we're going to return the waste to the mine site and all those sorts of things. I had some very tough questions. In fact, we'd only just completed preparation of our environmental review and management program, and the questions I had were just as tough as those I had from the people here in WA. At the end of it, the managing director said to me, "Dudley, I can see that you and the company intend to operate in accordance with the best environmental practice. I'm now authorising the procurement manager to negotiate a supply agreement with you." Now that is what we want to see with more and more original equipment manufacturers. Environmental policy is not a 40-page document at the back of the annual report. It's a commitment by the CEO and other people in these companies to make sure that their supply chain goes right the way back to the source. And I think the Australian mining industry has to work harder to convince those original equipment manufacturers that the supply chain does begin at the mine, and Australia is the preferred partner in terms of that first stage, all-important first stage. At Australian Rare Earths, we look at the whole supply chain. At the moment we've got some exploration taking place and a lot of process test work being underway at ANSTO. Late last year, we carried out a mining exercise in which we mined about 3,500 tonnes to provide about 500 tonnes for some test work, a large part of which is being progressively shipped to ANSTO for some test work. The other part of the trial process was to demonstrate that we could rehabilitate the mine once we'd processed it. And we're very fortunate. Copper-Murra is an ionic clay. So the ore is in, we don't have to drill any further than 15 metres. It's air core. There will be no drill and blast in the operation. And it takes us about half an hour to drill a hole. And the operation itself would be very similar to the mineral sands operation, where we'll mine it, we'll take off the topsoil, take off the overburden, mine the clay, process it, neutralise the residue from the processing, and then return it all to the pit. And what we've done here, we've demonstrated that once we've completed the processing, we can return the pastures, the land holding to its original state. That's a photograph of the mine, trial mine, and the rehabilitation process. The CEO of Neo Performance Materials. Now, Neo Performance Materials is the premier producer of rare earth permanent magnets. As I said earlier, they've just committed to the construction of a magnet plant in Estonia as part of the EU's intent to expand their rare earth permanent magnet production there. Konstantin Karinopoulos, the CEO, came to Copper-Murra and saw that. And he said to us, he said, "Can I send my original equipment manufacturers here so that they can see what you're doing at the front end?" This is very important to me because at the moment, the terbium dysprosium that I'm using in our magnets is sourced from neither China or Myanmar. So here we have a classic example of where there's a mining company, Australian Rare Earths, and Neo Performance Materials, which is a leader in the production of rare earth permanent magnets. We're working together across the total supply chain. And it does begin at the mine. There's a lot of things that one can do at the mine that actually help the people at the end. Now, if you segregate it and you just sell from one step to the next, there's limited opportunity to do that. And the reason that China is so successful is that it's vertically integrated. So we're going to aim to be vertically integrated by collaborating with everybody in the steps from the mine right the way through to the production of electric vehicles or wind turbines. And I've had preliminary discussions with people at the end, and they certainly appreciate it when we go there and talk to people and explain the importance of that. So briefly, we're all aware there's a shortage of a lot of these critical materials, so that's a great opportunity for Australian Rare Earths to supply supply a significant portion of those rare earths that are used in rare earth permanent magnets. A quick overview of how China's got to where it is. China takes a very long-term view. It's taken 50 years for it to progress from its initial entry into the rare earth sector some 50 years ago. 10, 15 years ago, there were over 100 rare earth mines. China has now consolidated those just by closing those that don't meet environmental standards, but it doesn't necessarily enforce the environmental standards that strictly, and by means of production quotas. Over the last 2 years, it's reallocated the production quotas such that the two largest rare earth companies in China produce over 95% of the rare earths produced in China. Translated, this means there's two companies that are supplying over 80% of the world's demand for rare earths. The story is that each of the CEOs of those two rare earth companies has a red phone on their desk, and when the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology wishes to change the price or give instructions as to the production rate, they have to pick up the red phone and take that. So there is no doubt that China is using its monopoly to control the industry. This is best described here pictorially in this graph. And the way I could describe it is France will sell you a bottle of wine, but it doesn't really want to sell you the grapes. China doesn't really want to sell you rare earths. It's much rather sell you electric vehicles and wind turbines and those sorts of things. And that's what we aim to do, is to be able to challenge China, is to be vertically integrated by collaborating with your partners in the supply chain. Underwriting all this, and I'm not disappointed, having accepted that invitation by Bryn and Rick to join the board of Australian Rare Earths beginning of last year, and then for the listing on the 1st of July last year. We now have a resource of 100 million tonnes, and in the next couple of months, will be an update on that resource. We have an exploration target based upon the drilling to date of about 300 million tonnes to 1.4 billion tonnes, which will mean that Copper-Murra is a multi-generational province for the production of rare earths. This is quite unique and continues to confirm Australian Rare Earths as potentially the first ionic clay rare earth producer in Australia. So why am I still excited about the prospects for Australian rare earths? Undoubtedly, the fact that we have this large resource at Copper-Murra. It is a typical ionic clay resource. It's close to the surface. We can mine it fairly readily. There's no radioactivity. The process work that we've carried out at ANSTO demonstrate that it is typical of those ionic clays in China. And as part of our agreement with Neo Performance Materials, they will buy 50% of our initial output. And to make sure that that output meets their criteria, they have an input to our metallurgical test work. So that when we produce our rare earth carbonate, and we've produced a sample initially, a little way to go, but when we actually complete that test work, we know that what we're going to produce is what Neo want. Now, at the moment, it's very difficult for many other people to do that, because the only takers are China or Neo Performance Materials. And we're the only company that has that agreement with Neo, and we're working together right the way through the supply chain, from the mine to the production of the magnets, to make sure that we can meet the end user's needs. As I've said, we've got the test works being undertaken at ANSTO, and we've got input from a number of international consultants assisting us with that. We have very strong community relations. Jackie Owen, who's based down in Naracoorte, has done an excellent job of securing a number of land agreements with us. And we do have the criteria for low capital costs and operating costs I think my time has run out, so I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dudley. We're out of time for questions there, I'm afraid.